There is no such thing as a neutral algorithm. A handful of private companies control what over 5 billion people see online. Who owns the platforms? We don't vote for who controls them. We don't do referendums on what those policies are. So users have very little power in this particular ecosystem where we all spend our time. What if users could choose their own algorithms? We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. And I think what we should be prioritizing is ensuring that users are doing more of the shaping. My name is Renee. I am a professor at Georgetown, and today I am going to be doing a little bit of a provocation called the case for middleware in social media. I'm going to start by saying that a handful of private companies control what over 5 billion people see online, right? So a few platforms mediate what we see, what gets removed, and that private power is both very opaque and very consequential. It has significant impacts for social consensus. It has significant impacts for democracy. It even has significant impacts on how we decide what is real. So in 2020, there was a Stanford working group convened by Frank Fukuyama. This was called the Stanford Working Group on Platform Scale. And it made the argument that platforms as information curators really have the power to steer user attention. And that the downstream effects of steering user attention mean that they shape what people see, which has downstream impacts on democracy and on deliberation. And that users themselves have very little recourse over what the platforms do. We don't vote for who owns the platforms. We don't vote for who controls them. We don't do referendums on what those policies are. So users have very little power in this particular ecosystem where we all spend our time. So centralized platforms equals consolidated power. What does this mean? This means also that the people who own the platforms shape the ethos, right? So they are shaping what the algorithms decide to show you. There is no such thing as a neutral algorithm. However content is ranked for you, there is a value judgment that is baked into that. Anytime you open your Facebook feed, anytime you open your X feed, whatever it is, if there is a ranked feed, even if it is just ranked in reverse chronological order, somebody has made a decision about what is most important to show you. There is also a value judgment based into any kind of moderation policy. Again, the ethos of the platform, the ethos of the owners, determines what is in those policies. One of my very favorite moderation policies is Rumble's, which is the only platform that has a line in it that says, "We do not allow content glorifying Antifa." I personally think it's absolutely fantastic that they can do this. The reason they can do this is because they are a private company. We're going to talk about that in a second. Alex Jones, who has been booted off of many platforms, has a terms of service for InfoWars, which has the wonderful line, civilizations have rules. If you violate the rules, you'll be kicked out of the tribe. This is a private company. And again, every private company repeatedly emphasizes that they are setting the rules for their community. And one of the reasons that they do that is because they are setting the rules that shape the experience for the other users. But because these platforms also shape deliberation and democracy, powerful politicians have realized that working the referees, trying to shape the rules of the platforms, has downstream impacts that pay off for them. And so what you see is politicians across the political spectrum and civil society groups and others doing this working the referees process where they try to apply certain types of pressure, sometimes explicitly coercive, sometimes more subtle, where they're trying to make the platforms change the rules in accordance with what they want them to be, in hopes that that shifts curation to maximize their viewpoints being seen, that shifts moderation such that maybe their political enemies get moderated a little bit more and are seen a little bit less. But again, just to emphasize, on a private platform, the First Amendment right belongs to the platform, not to the user, so they have the right to do this. Anybody who tells you otherwise doesn't understand the law or doesn't understand, again, that the user experience on a private platform that is unmoderated is terrible. Just show of hands, how many people in here spend time on 4chan? Nobody, right? And that's why. But what if users could choose their own algorithms? The thing that I want to talk about in this talk is what happens if we were to shift away from a centralized model of control to something where users have more control over the experience themselves. And the term that we use for this in social media kind of architecture and design is middleware. So middleware is open, third-party, composable services that sit between users and platforms, and that users or communities can select from to shape their curation and moderation experiences. Composable means that they can choose from a bunch of different ones, they're not locked into a particular one, and they can move back and forth between them according to the experience that they might want to have that day or that moment. So when we write about or talk about middleware, most of us who write about it or talk about it, seeing it addressing three critical areas. So the first is curation. Again, that is what is emphasized or upranked or shown to a user. Moderation, which is what's filtered out, removed, reduced, or labeled, right? That's the sort of three buckets of content moderation. And then the third thing is reputation. How do we decide how to use social media to better surface things like social cues? One of the things that kept happening during the pandemic, I don't know if people remember this in early 2020, was there were a lot of people who were just saying things, right? And Twitter had to decide how to surface good information versus bad. And so it started trying to blue check a bunch of doctors, just so that people could know that in this particular case, the reputation of this user, this is somebody you should take a little bit more seriously. This is a person who actually is a frontline physician, and when they tell you COVID is real, they might actually know something about that. So I want to walk through some examples of what this looks like on a platform called BlueSky. I know that BlueSky has a reputation for being lib Twitter, but the reason I'm going to talk about it and use it in these examples is that BlueSky is built on an open protocol called AT-Proto, which anybody can go and build on. And one of the things that's quite nice about BlueSky is that this open architecture means that an entire proliferation of user-created feeds and user-created labelers have come into existence. So if you want to actually see what it looks like to have this experience where you can do this switching back and forth between feeds and labelers, BlueSky is the platform where you can do this. So instead of one black box feed where you have a For You page and God knows what winds up on it or why, users can pick from competing ranks and feeds, toggle across them, or even in our kind of future vision of the world, those of us who like middleware, you could envision a world in which you're subscribing to potentially even branded lenses. Maybe you want the New York Times feed, maybe you want the Fox News feed. The ones that I kind of screenshotted over here, I think you've got the science one, trending art, BlueSky, which is a community of African American and Black community users. So these custom feeds and lenses really provide an opportunity to restore user agency and choice. And they're actually quite easy to use. I am an extremely mediocre gardener, and I take pictures of my very mediocre garden, and I can use the little sprout emoji, and the sprout emoji ahead of the post indicates that I want my post, that specific post, to wind up in the gardening feed, where other people who have subscribed to the gardening feed will see it, but it won't necessarily bore all of the other people who don't want to see my okra plants, right? This is an example of a labeler. There are many, many different labelers that you can choose from. You can think of a labeler as being akin to a moderation feed. So this is one of many. You can choose from among different types of potential labelers to get a sense of how different creators with different values that might be aligned with yours can choose to moderate content in a way that might be aligned with your values. You can then employ extremely granular toggling between them to choose whether you want posts to be fully visible, to be fully hidden, or to be hidden behind an interstitial. So this is another example where, rather than what's known as the customer service model of moderation, where you yell mods and somebody comes and helps you, this puts agency into your hands, and you get to say, I'm going to use this tool, and I'm going to very granularly set the rules that I want to choose from. How many people in here remember Clout? I know some of you are my age, so some of you definitely do. Okay, there we go. Clout was an idea before its time. Clout was a product that allowed you to plus K and sort of indicate that somebody in your community knew something a little bit more about a given topic. You could plus K your friends for sharks, indicating that they knew a lot about sharks. This is the sort of thing where you have this notion of giving a little bit of extra visibility into who else is on a network with you. Not necessarily conferred from the top down by a centralized authority, but that a community can do amongst itself. And I know Dick Reisman, who's in the audience, writes quite a bit about this particular aspect of middleware. So what are the promises and perils of what this kind of alternative ecosystem of content creation and moderation looks like? So I think there's sort of three big positives that we see right now. The first is that it really democratizes control. So users opt in, right? You can be on BlueSky and use absolutely none of these things if you don't want to. If you want that out-of-the-box default experience that is moderated by the centralized BlueSky moderator, controlled by the sort of BlueSky developer team, you can have it if you want to. But if you want to have this granular experience, that is available to you too. So much more democratized. We see it as enabling innovation. One of the things with centralized platforms is that you are really at the mercy of the centralized platforms. But if you move into a world of protocol-based platforms, there's just a lot more that you could conceivably do to drive innovation and really transform what the social experience is like. And then reduces techlash. I throw this on there even though personally I find it obnoxious. Because again, I think that there is a little bit in the way of creating backlash against certain things that are perfectly legitimate, like a platform deciding to set its rules the way that it wants to. I think that this actually is something that a centralized platform can do. And my preference is to have middleware added on as an option, while also recognizing that there are certain perfectly legitimate things that centralized platform companies do using their First Amendment rights to moderate as they see fit. So, what are the downsides? The first, and the one that people will most often talk to me about when I say that I'm a supporter of middleware, is echo chambers. But then people will self-sort into feeds that will only show them what they want to see. This is potentially quite true. And so one of the things that I see as a big value of it is that by presenting these options for different feeds, you do actually have the availability of like kind of changing the culture and saying you can juxtapose these two things side by side. Go ahead, give it a try. You're not committing to following a whole lot of people. When you tell people, oh, just follow a bunch of Democrats and a bunch of Republicans on X and that's how you'll see diverse viewpoints, that's actually quite an arduous thing to do. I think that middleware does provide an opportunity to break out of echo chambers by making that toggling significantly easier. There are moderation gaps. This is something that, again, when people say they don't like content moderation, they just don't realize it until they've had their address posted to the internet, right? And this is one of the things where, unfortunately, no centralized labeler is going to be able to solve that problem for you. Or no decentralized labeler, I should say, will be able to solve that problem for you. That is where centralized moderation is quite strong. Same thing with spam, same thing with certain types of illegal content. So in some ways, centralization does have certain advantages for certain types of moderation. The last two things are technical complexity and privacy challenges. And this is where we are very, very actively working on what this looks like in the physical implementation. Glenn and I have a project on this now, actually. So my personal preference is hybrid architectures. I don't think we should think of middleware as some panacea, but I think it's an enabling architecture that has the potential to really balance and create a better balance of power between the extremely top-down controlled architecture that we have now and a potential for a much more democratized bottom-up architecture that creates a lot more pluralism and a lot more user agency in a more protocol-based, decentralized future. Is this possible? So right now, what we might like to see is centralized platforms adding this on as an option. Twitter, actually, back when it was Twitter, before it was X, had certain components of middleware that you could use. There was a tool called Block Party that was sort of a third-party provider that actually let you do mass blocking if you were a person who frequently dealt with a lot of harassment. That was an example of a third-party tool that people actually paid for that acted on a user's behalf on a otherwise centralized platform. However, most platforms don't actually engage particularly constructively in this space. So that's one of the significant challenges. There are also, again, the technical challenges. How do you do this in a way that doesn't introduce a lot of bugs, a lot of security risks into a centralized platform? This is where the protocol-based models are a little bit easier to work with. The challenge there, of course, is that they have a far smaller user base. And then the business model uncertainty that Glenn alluded to, which is how do you make this something that the people who produce middleware, the people who are producing those tools, like Block Party, which I mentioned, can actually earn a sustainable living because otherwise it turns into a little bit of the challenge of open source software, where you have passion projects, but that requires the organizers of the projects having to do a significant amount of work to continue to drive the engagement of a undercompensated community. And when you're talking about content moderation in particular, for the people who are making the labelers, oftentimes that involves engaging with content that can be what we call lawful but awful, just sort of repulsive stuff that people don't want to look at over the long term, particularly not for unpaid volunteer reasons. But on the flip side, there is a lot of user dissatisfaction with the status quo, right? Platforms are also kind of fed up with it. They're looking for alternative models that enable them to wrangle that dissatisfaction better. There is a push for interoperability. This is coming out of Europe. European regulation is like, you will be interoperable. So there is actually interesting, dynamic shifts that are coming out of regulations that are happening in the Digital Markets Act and elsewhere that are potentially leading to some feasibility where user data access laws are going to shift. And that market is going to potentially lead to downstream shifts here in the US as well. And then finally, on the innovative models front, again, some of us are actively doing research into this. Glenn and his team are one, but there are others as well. And I think that exploratory potential is where we really want to be. So I think, how do you help us get there? I think supporting those interoperability standards, experimenting with emerging platforms, and envisioning a more pluralistic internet where users control their experience. If there is demand, platforms often do respond. So that's where I think that we really need to be to sort of continue to move this vision in this emerging market into more of a sustainable reality. And then I'll just close with this quote, which is from Father John Culkin, a contemporary of Marshall McLuhan. "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." And I think what we should be prioritizing is ensuring that users are doing more of the shaping. So thank you very much.